Hi, everyone. Welcome to Healthy Poor. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Laura Green, and today we are going to be talking about trauma and emotional burnout. So, a few notes as we move into that. This is not therapy. This is psychoeducation. So we are learning about different emotional reactions you might be having during this time. Kind of maybe how your brain might be processing it. This is not a replacement for therapy, but this is an opportunity for you to maybe learn a little bit about yourself and your experience, and kind of maybe recognize a few things that you might be experiencing and find a way to name them through this. We do have some resources for you if during this webinar you are feeling some feelings that might be a little bit unmanageable in the moment. There are some resources, different hotlines. You can find them at healthypoor.org if you need help. But a note on that, if you do feel some stuff come up as we talk about this, be kind to yourself as you do feel that. I'll say this every time, feelings are normal. Feelings are our friends. They help us understand what our experiences are and indicate, kind of cue to us where what we might need to do to change so that we can exist and thrive in the world that we are living in. So if you feel things, that's cool. If you feel stuff like maybe guilt or shame, understand that that's normal, like absolutely normal. Feelings are normal. And take this opportunity to kind of forgive yourself for feeling those things and whatever it is that's bringing them on, and just acknowledge them. We will also be sharing those resources at the end, but you have them now if you do have to log off and call somebody. Today we are going to be talking about trauma and burnout. A little bit about me. I am a licensed professional in mental health, a licensed professional counselor. I also work in the hospitality industry. I have for now decades of my life. I've worked in a craft context for the last 10 years, so I am very intimately knowledgeable of what the hospitality industry looks like in a lot of different forms, but I am also a licensed professional counselor. I'm a therapist. So is Jessica, and she's here too. Can you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica. I am also a mental health professional and have been in the industry for a long time as well. I'm really excited to be here today since my research and clinical experiences focuses on trauma and responses to it. My experience is generally more around like sexual abuse and harassment, but I know that there's huge overlap between trauma and emotional burnout in this industry, so I'm so excited to talk about it.
Yeah, so I think we should maybe just hop right into it. I think trauma is a scary thing to talk about too for a lot of people. Maybe emotional burnout less so. Burnout is definitely a term that gets thrown around a lot, and not without reason. It's because a lot of people are experiencing it. But with trauma, something that we were talking about before we really got started on this was the compounded trauma of, basically just working in the hospitality industry and what that looks like, and the trauma that we're experiencing in terms of COVID. But I will turn it over to Jess, and I'm just gonna let you go and talk about this because, this is your area. This is you.
Let's do it. I'm excited. Not that I'm excited that people experience trauma, but I'm excited to educate people on it.
I want to say one thing about that really quick is that when I first started doing this, I had to interview a therapist, and she's like, I love trauma. And I was horrified. And she's like, no, it's just, I love talking about it. It's her expertise and everything. So if we get excited talking about this, it's because we're passionate about it, not because it's exciting to experience. So yeah, okay. Now
yes,
this time.
Exactly. So just to start from the very basics, what is trauma? A very literal translation would be a wound. And I think it's funny because every time someone says the word trauma, I think everyone has this like schema or like image that pops into your head about what you think of as trauma. And it's such a broad word. And so it encompasses so many different things. And I think that that's really interesting, but also really interesting how everyone kind of manifests their understanding of it differently. So I think a lot of people, when you hear the word trauma, think of maybe like war or sexual violence, something like very extreme. And so within the field of psychology, we've kind of broken it down a little bit just so people can understand that trauma is very different. And so we have these things called big T traumas and little t traumas. And they both are very important. And it's not to discredit you if you only experience little t traumas, or, you know, you have a worse outcome if you experience big T traumas. But big T traumas are those things that we generally think about when we think of that like diagnosis of PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. So, you know, going to war and coming back and experiencing combat and watching people die, sexual abuse, childhood abuse, things like that are what we would consider big T traumas. And big T trauma often comes with that diagnosis of PTSD. Doesn't have to, though. And then little T traumas are generally things that happen kind of more isolated, and then more, not frequently, but like say something like verbal harassment or the end of a significant relationship. So they weigh on you, and they're really important to acknowledge and take time to process through. But they might not meet that diagnostic criteria. And so when I talk about diagnostic criteria, there's this big book of, are you about to pull it out?
It's up there, but I'm wearing shorts, so I'm not going to grab it.
It's just this big book we use to help understand what's going on in people's lives. And to get a diagnosis, you have to meet certain criteria. And so that doesn't make it worse or better, just different. So that's how we as therapists kind of understand where you are with experiencing trauma. And to like not get too statisticky here, but like over 70% of people experience trauma. So this is something that's happening very frequently to a lot of people, but it's really not talked about very often as far as like the everyday person having trauma, which kind of goes with the stigma of therapy in itself, but just knowing that. And then another statistic, sorry, I know I hate these too, but 30% of people experience like 4 or more different types of trauma. So just because you experience one really terrible instance of trauma doesn't mean that there's not other things in your life that are confounding with that, or you're experiencing different things based on this one terrible experience. So I think that's important to keep in mind too, especially like there's many different phases of your life: childhood, adolescence, adulthood. And so sometimes these things carry with you, especially if you're not addressing them, and they manifest in different ways. And I think that's really important to keep in mind too, that sometimes that can be like, that trauma can be experienced in different settings. So just some like quick examples of what trauma can be. I've talked about, you know, war and sexual assault. Could also be like a natural disaster, like a tornado, a hurricane, a pandemic. It could be something like witnessing a car crash. It could be something, you know, like even in the hospitality, having someone verbally assault you in the workplace. If you're behind the bar, that could happen. I'm sure that's happened to almost everyone more than once. Even like a really busy night, that like anxiety that's produced from having those experiences, that could be considered trauma if your body's not able or willing to adapt to it. So I think those are really important things to keep in mind. And
also that it's quite relative. So just like stress, I think you were going to say that and I totally cut you off, but like just like stress, you might be able to so with stress, like something might stress somebody out that doesn't stress you out, you know. So something might be traumatic for somebody that from the outside you're like, I experienced that wasn't traumatic for me, but it's a very relative experience, and it's, you know, not a one size fits all thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I was kind of going to go into how people experience trauma, and that's exactly what I was going to say along those same lines. Is so some people might, you know, have nightmares or flashbacks, and other people might just experience like that kind of anxiety in your gut. Other people might not be able to sleep or eat because of it. And so that's why when we talk about trauma, it's so broad, but yet so specific to that person. Like, it's so relevant to how you experience it, but there's so many different ways that it can manifest. And I think that's just really important to keep in mind when you're thinking about yourself and reflecting on like what's happened in your life and how you deal with that. And so then just to kind of think about what's happening when you experience trauma in your brain has like a reaction to it, and actually different, without getting like into the brain functioning, because I know that's boring, things are happening in your brain when you experience trauma. So for example, we hear these stories about like, you smelled something and that was re-traumatizing to someone, right? So it's little things like that. So you take the initial traumatic experience, and then the way that your brain reacts to it is it's able to pick up on threats more quickly because of that traumatic experience. So it's your brain is more hyper aware to threats, but then it's not able to process it as well as the first time or you experience trauma, or as the way you process other things. So for example, that same thing I just talked about, you smell something, then when you smell that thing again, you might not be able to calm down, even though you realize that is like from the initial experience. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. That's a good way to think. I had never considered trauma like that, or heard about it like in that way, that it's like, oh, there's a connection has been restored. That it's like, it's an indicator that something's wrong. Like, it's that I just had never thought about it like that. I always thought about it as drawing someone back in, but it's actually a survival mechanism. That makes sense. And I'm like, huh.
Yeah. So that like fight, flight, freeze, or fawn mechanism, right? It's very easily triggered, but then very difficult to back down. And I think that's really, counterintuitive, because now you're in this space where you're all stressed out, and you can't like regulate it because your body is just like stuck there almost.
Yeah.
So that's terribly painful.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that, we think about trauma, obviously, many different ways. And so I like to think about it when we talk about the industry, there's so many different ways that it manifests, especially like collectively. So we know there's all these stigmas with working in this industry. If you've ever worked behind a bar, someone has definitely asked you what you do outside of work, what you do in your free time, right? And it's like, I'm here, I'm a professional in this industry. So that's just one minute example, but that like kind of collective energy that we all spend together talking about working in this industry and the battles that come with it, working busy nights where, our anxiety is accelerated, different ways that like if you go to buy a house or buy a car, you can't. And so the way that the systems of the world we live in kind of stigmatize our industry, different things like that, that all affects you continuously over time. And I don't think a lot of people talk about that or think about that, but it really is impactful on your day-to-day life, because you have to be constantly adapting based on your situation, right? Like even when you get off work and you want to go have a drink, because we can't work a busy night and just go straight to bed because our bodies are pumping with adrenaline, that's still stigmatized in like a way that we it's a coping mechanism, of course, but it's also, it sits with you over time. And like, whether it's in your own brain or the way the world views you, it's still trauma. It's still it's still affecting your day to day and the way that you conceptualize yourself and others. And I think that's important.
Yeah. So I sat in on a seminar when I was in school that someone was talking about exactly this, these like micro traumas that you move through life with that become a collective. And he described it as, if you look at yourself as a marble statue, and there's just a little drop of water that doesn't, at the moment, just a drop of water, but if it keeps dropping and dropping and dropping, it starts to erode away at your identity and yourself and your personhood in a lot of ways. But it starts to essentially make a tremendous impact when it had just been a drop of water.
Yeah. And I think we see this in research a lot with like African American individuals who experience, one tiny microaggression, right? But over time that adds up, and that's like really turns into the way you view yourself and the way you view others around you. And to like ignore that or say you can't necessarily like call out every microaggression directed at you, mm-hmm. but to understand that that does play a part in how you view yourself is so important, because it affects you, and to discredit it or write it off really isn't fair.
Mm-hmm.
I also think about it in like, so there's this concept called secondary trauma where like you hear about someone who passed away and you watch that person. So like say my friend's husband died and I watched them experience immense amounts of grief and loss. That can affect me and play a role. So when we talk about people in this industry who bartenders are basically called, therapists, right? You're experiencing so much secondary trauma. And so to pretend that you can go home and ignore all of that at the end of the day just isn't accurate, because all of that is going to accumulate and sit with you after time as well, especially some of the more, verbose stories or more aggressive stories that you hear from people. I can't tell you how many crazy stories I've heard from working behind the bar over my time, and like can remember exactly who they are and like kind of bring myself back to that place in that moment in time. And so that's, a traumatic experience, right? That still sits with me. And so it's not, trauma doesn't have to be going to war and coming back, or, experiencing something so traumatic, so detrimental that you can't recover. It can also be these tiny little things that happen over time. And I think that's really what I want to kind of reiterate when we're talking about trauma, especially within the hospitality industry. It's so important to understand that that these things are happening, and to be kind to yourself, most importantly, because to ignore them actually does more damage than good. And so when we talk about like therapy within trauma and how people deal with that, most of the therapeutic modalities that focus on trauma deal with self-compassion and forgiveness. I was actually just learning about a process within the criminal justice system where they're trying to get people who are victims to kind of be able to forgive themselves and forgive the perpetrator. And that gives a lot of onus to the victim, depending on where they're at. But that whole idea of forgiveness is so important, both for the person that you're angry with or the person that you feel anger towards, if it's like a interpersonal trauma, and then with yourself, because to sit with that weight, it's going to kind of just dig that nail in deeper into the pain. And so that's something I think is just really important to think about as well. So like you can forgive and not forget, right? That old phrase.
Like that forgiveness is more for you. I think there's a common thought that forgiveness is like somehow, saying that if let's say it was an interpersonal trauma, like you brought up, that it's that it was okay that it happened. That's not what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is more about sort of coming to a balanced place within yourself about that situation. So it's more for you, and not forgiving is just it's also continuing to hurt yourself. But forgiveness is rough. It's a thing.
Yeah, no, it's not an easy process, and it's not something you just say, oh, okay, I'm going to forgive you now. It's like a thing you have to work on and, sit down with yourself and spend time going through. But you hear a lot from victims of like sexual assault and sexual violence that's the one thing they want, is to like be able to like not speak to the person, but like know that, say to that person, like, I forgive you. And I think that's just so interesting, and just speaks to the weight of, we build up these things in our heads and we like put physical weight associated with them. And so they really affect you more than you might be willing to like recognize or honor. And I think that that's so important.
Yeah.
we have a question. I just want to read it for a second. Do you find Yeah, that's such a good question. I mean, we kind of spoke to it a little bit earlier, but there's like such stigma around trauma, right? Like, just as there is therapy and just as there is having emotions. And I think that accepting, so there's stigma around like vulnerability. And so to have vulnerability, our society deems weakness, right? And so to experience trauma is to be vulnerable, right? Or to say I've experienced trauma is to be vulnerable. And I think that's just really hard because people around you are going to perceive you a certain way because of that. And that's, I think that's part of the healing process.
I also think that there's this, it's kind of in line with stigmas of being like, well, someone else experienced this, so what I experienced wasn't so bad. So that couldn't have been a traumatic experience because it wasn't that bad, and then diminishing it as a coping mechanism from it. I think there's a lot of power in naming your trauma, which is where someone, having someone help you through that, be it a therapist or a religious leader or a close friend or something like that, naming your trauma has a lot of power, and I think within this context, first of all, saying like there's a lot of trauma that's experienced within the hospitality industry, either like the big T's or the little T's. I think certainly both exist, but also that within the collective experience, this is inherently traumatic. It's a big including of everything.
Yeah. And we see this a lot during this pandemic, right? So like people who are sitting at home and able to, still get an income, still have food on the table, and relatively thrive through this process are still, they're trying to like, well, other people don't have food on the table. Other people are stuck in this tiny space. That doesn't mean that you're not struggling with this and this isn't difficult. And so that's almost does more harm to kind of write that off and not honor that you're experiencing pain through this. While that is very endearing that you are so thoughtful and that you think about other people so much, it's, you have to love yourself and be kind to yourself because no one is breezing through this process. Everyone is experiencing difficulty.
I think that's a good point to bring up, that like nobody's breezing through this. And it does get hard right now because, some people live alone. Some people live with their families. Some people are still working. Some people are not. And there are challenges in all of those different scenarios. And, the guilt that comes in too, I think is really painful for people of like, I'm struggling, but I shouldn't be complaining because I have a job, or I'm really struggling with my family right now, but I shouldn't be complaining because at least I'm not alone, So those are some big emotions that might be coming up right now too, that are maybe being neglected in your experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of, so I have this point, I'm reading this book right now called The Choice, and it's really interesting. It's about this psychologist who, she lived through the Holocaust. And then when she got out, she became a psychologist. And I'm just like, that is fascinating and amazing, right? But all of her clients, she discloses that to them and all of them feel guilt. And they're like, my pain's not as, severe as your pain. Yeah. And I'm like, that is, that's got to be so difficult. But she talks about victimization versus victimhood. And I think it's such a great point. Like, victimization is when something occurs to you and it's exterior, and there's this exterior control where you are being the victim of a crime or, some sort of trauma. But then there's victimhood, where it changes, where it's inside and it's internal. It's the way you view yourself. And so you don't get to change the victimization that's happened to you, but you get to change how you view yourself and how you view your victimhood. And so to like think about that and go forward and say, I have been victimized, but I'm going to grow from this and use this to help facilitate strength and build strength, I think is just such a beautiful point. And I know that's like, I'm not trying to write that off and say that that's an easy process. That is a long process full of lots of pain, but you can come out of that so strong and such, so much more aware of your own being.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whew. How are you all? Can I check in with everybody? How y'all doing? Feeling okay? Feeling solid? Oh, there's a poll. Good. I'm going to answer it so I can see. So Jessica, I don't know if you know this, but if you answer the poll, then you can see the
Oh, cool.
Yeah, submit vote. Okay.
All right. Sorry.
Okay, that's really helpful for us, since we can't really feel your energy or see your faces. It is helpful for us to kind of see feeling okay. Hi, Edie. So that's good. So we had a question come through, and then because then I'm going to move into burnout. Oh, Debbie.
That's my mom.
That's really so. Debbie asked about also what about the trauma of being dismissed? Oh wait, as a human with feelings just because you were serving someone night after night, it starts to weigh on your self-worth. Mm-hmm.
Such a good question.
Yep.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think we're going to talk about this with an emotional burnout, but this could be like a nice segue into it. This job is emotional labor.
Yep.
It's physical labor. You're running around. It's mental labor. I don't know, remember orders. You have to be ready to do your job, but then it's also emotional. We've talked about the bartender as the therapist. We've talked about, people disclosing information to you, busy nights where your adrenaline's pumping. Everything about this job is emotionally difficult.
Yep. So emotional labor, I know is a term that we kind of hear a lot. But what emotional labor is when you have to use your emotional set and life within a workplace situation. People who use emotional labor are therapists, doctors, teachers, and hospitality individuals, especially public-facing folk. So there's two kinds of emotional labor. There's surface emotional labor, and then there's deep emotional labor. And surface emotional labor is when you take all your emotions and you squash it, and then you put on a good face, like, hi, welcome. Can I get you some water? My name's Laura. I'm your server today. Whatever, I'm your bartender. That sort of like, I'm going to put on a happy face. I'm going to go on stage. I'm going to provide this surface emotional outreach that's happening. But what's happening in your more authentic feelings, it might be tumultuous. Someone might have, not looked you in the eye during the conversation, these like micro dehumanizing pieces that come in, and we experience and maybe sometimes find it challenging to name all the time within our industry, like those pieces. So you might be feeling these things on the inside, but then on here, you're like, great, coming right up, or, however it is you interact. Now, deep emotional labor is that more authentic emotional labor that comes through, that you are allowed to feel what you're feeling while also using your emotions in a way that allows you to do your job, or you're required to do your job. So like an example for in therapy is making sure that, we are interacting authentically with clients and people who we're talking to, and we're not like, stifling ourselves to a point that it's damaging to us. Also, taking care of ourselves emotionally, seeing therapists ourselves and stuff like that, so that we can be authentic and true in the moment while still using our emotions in a healthy way. In terms of hospitality, what that would look like is, I've been thinking actually a lot about this, and it's like, I think it's a service training thing, like training people to, when we do service training, it's not like you're on stage, fake it till you make it, like kind of getting rid of language like that and saying like, we are looking to create a authentic and responsible interaction so that we can create this really wonderful experience for you. And we are going to be using our emotions to do that. And this is how you can manage stressful situations authentically without harming yourself or without diminishing what that experience looks like. But all of that being said is we are constantly using our emotions in order to get the job done. Within stressful situations and stressful and often, as Jessica mentioned, traumatic situations, we're moving through that and not always doing the best job managing it. So it's like stress on stress on stress on stress on stress. And it becomes a more heightened, chronic, stressful situation. I think that's a good point to transition to talk a little bit about the difference between stress and burnout. And then we can really talk about what burnout is and what it looks like within our industry. So stress is like an external thing comes at you and you have a physical and emotional reaction. So like that can be, your tickets are, your printer is going crazy and all these cocktails are coming through, or, you're in the weeds and like food's dragging behind and you can't get them out, or you can't run your dishes fast. Now, these are all stressful experiences that you're going to have a reaction to. And your reactions physiologically and psychologically, cognitively are elevated. So it's like hypervigilance. So you start sweating, adrenaline kicks in. You kind of maybe get a little jittery or anxious, and your emotional life is elevated. So if you were angry, you're a little bit more angry now, everything kind of gets the volume turned up on it. That's stress. And so then you have your coping mechanism after that. And we've talked about this. If you've been in a few of these webinars, you have your coping mechanism and then you hopefully manage it. And the goal is to come down from that so that if you experience it again, it's not as elevated, right? Burnout, though related to stress, is kind of like the opposite of stress in the way that stress brings you up and burnout dulls you. One of my favorite descriptors of burnout is that it's the erosion of the soul, which is like,
it's like
yeah. I read that and I was just like, oh, that is so real. So burnout is essentially when you run out, when you have been experiencing such high emotions or such high feelings that you haven't been refilled, right? Like, I guess the reason this whole thing, I call it healthy pour, is helping you pour from a full cup. So burnout is when you've depleted yourself to the point that, or you've been depleted and you haven't been refilled, that you just kind of grow numb. There's a few stages of burnout. The first is exhaustion. So it's like, it can manifest as physical exhaustion. You might not be able, you're not quite as quick, in thinking as you were, you're tired all the time. Just things are a little bit harder to do and you're just emotionally exhausted and physically exhausted, and they're kind of like manifesting together. The next one is cynicism and apathy. And this is actually, in terms of my fascination with this is my favorite part of burnout, because it's so tangible and you can feel the moment that kicks in. When something like within the workplace that you were really into, some of you were like, oh man, I don't want to do that. And I don't care, And another way, the cynicism piece and dehumanizing piece, the example I tend to use when talking about it within a hospitality and context is like when you're behind the bar, and reminder, it's like your whole job to create wonderful and amazing experiences for people. And like the nicest couple comes up and they sit down and you look at them and you're like, wow, go fuck yourself. Like that is burnout. That cynicism, that dehumanization, like you're not dehumanizing yourself, but you're dehumanizing someone else to cope with the fact that you don't have anything to give them. Right?
Yeah.
So then the last one is like total inefficacy. apathy, like you start being really bad at your job, and you kind of recognize that you're bad at your job. But these 3 steps are important to know, because you can have that sort of exhaustion come in, and it's important to like think to yourself, okay, I might be tired for sure. Or is this the beginning of burnout? But once that cynicism and that that bitterness hits in, and we all know I felt it. I've been behind the bar and like, oh, I'm burned out. We've experienced that, and we've met the bitter folk. That's burnout. So workplace burnout and emotional burnout are tied into each other because our identities are so tied into what our professions are, kind of what it is we do for work. DJ, who was on this program a few weeks ago, said something just recent. Wait, now I forgot what he said. Oh my God, it just went out of my head. It's okay. What were we talking about? Oh, that when we introduce ourselves, we're like, hi, my name is Laura. What do you do? It's like the second or third question, what neighborhood do you live in? What do you do? We're very tied into our identities. So what happens in our work life is so tied to our emotional life as a result. So if you have this identity of, I'm a beverage professional, I'm a chef, or whatever that looks like, and then there's already burnout happening there, and it's tied into your identity, and then all of a sudden it's gone. That's incredibly stressful. So I hope that you're all also kind of seeing, as I talk about that, how the trauma and burnout meet and come together and overlap in some of these ways. So in context of what we're experiencing right now and the emotional burnout that people might be feeling, our emotions are elevated. We're probably experiencing larger emotions than what we're used to, all at the same time. And they're very complex, like we mentioned earlier about like guilt and, sadness compounded with grief and all of these different feelings. What starts to happen is, if we're not replenished, my cat's trying to sit on my lap. If we're not being replenished or refilled, it starts to really drain on us to the point that we get really tired. We're emotionally exhausted. We're like, or it's hard to get out of bed. It's hard to complete tasks. Into that, well, it doesn't matter anyway. I'm stuck in my house. It doesn't matter anyway. Like, why should I clean my kitchen? Why should I vacuum the floor or whatever? Why should I do this project that I've been wanting to do for a long time and might have the opportunity to? I think that's something that we are all experiencing in a big way, but a pretty substantial, and there's a question I want to make sure. Good boy, Hank. Yeah, this is Hank. A really solid way to address burnout, and this is true for workplace burnout and emotional burnout, is to really address the emotional and the support that you have. So within the workplace, it's like a lot of it is about self-esteem and perceived organizational support. So like, how am I seeing how my organization is caring for me while I am caring for my organization? So there's like a social exchange that's happening there. And if either side is, not really fulfilled, that's when there becomes an imbalance, and that's where burnout starts kicking in. A really big cause for burnout within our industry is, I'm working 17-hour days and I'm not even seen. Like, I'm not taken care of. I don't have PTO. I don't have health insurance. And the perceived organizational support is quite low as a result. So you're giving, but you're not getting anything back. What's hard about right now in terms of feeling emotional support and feeling emotionally supported by other folk is that we don't have access to community the same way that we used to. So I can't go to the bar and hang out with my friends and kind of just like feel that emotional support, right?
Mm-hmm.
I can get on a Zoom. It's a little different though, because your brain isn't clicking in the same way as if you were in the room with other people. It's also like harder to connect with people on day to day, where we might have always been around other people and now we're not. So there's kind of a draining element there, because we're feeling emotions and putting them out, and we're not really getting much back. So the treatment, what really does help burnout is making sure that you're connecting with people. And that doesn't have to be a massive heart to heart. That can just be a simple, hey, I'm thinking about you, and while that might seem like you're just giving more, you're actually connecting with people. Being honest about when you need help, and when you need a little bit more support. I know that we're really notoriously not awesome at this in terms of a skill set, asking for help. But asking for help right now not only tells other people that it's okay to ask for help, but you'll also receive the support that you need, So even the littlest thing of like, I'm having a bad day today. Can you send me a picture of your dog? Whatever that might look like, and finding that connection so that you can be refilled. I want to answer this question. What are some things we can do as managers when trying to manage our employees and our own stress to help facilitate a healthy, happy team?
Great question.
Great question. And it does start from the top down, so if a manager is experiencing maybe something emotionally that's unhealthy for them, we feel that. Like, and I think, I know as I say that, I'm like kind of cataloging all of these memories in my head of times that I've been like either severely impacted by a manager that maybe wasn't coping with something very well, or walking away like, oh, that's a them thing and not a me thing. So there's a responsibility there for managers to really care for themselves. And also, if you are able to show your staff that you're caring for yourself, they'll start to care for themselves too, because you're modeling that healthy behavior. Some tips for that, again, it comes from the top down. A big one is making sure that you're not being overworked. Like, there's this thing in this industry that we're like, okay, now you're a manager, so you work 100 hours a week. That's not cool. So if you're in a situation where you're experiencing that, when you are open, advocating to be like, I am not able to work as efficiently when I'm working so many hours. Can we try something else? Can we figure out how to hire somebody, a second person to help out, or whatever that looks like? Advocating for yourself, but also when you're going into a situation where you're employed, making sure that you're heard, or at least that you say it, of being like, I do best at this when I work no more than 45 hours a week. Advocating for health insurance, and, like just taking time outside of work too to care for yourself. If it's your day off, don't go in. I used to do that all the time. It'd be my day off and I felt guilty for being away for whatever reason, and I would still go in, and that's not going to lead to productive work hours, and it's not going to lead to like overall healthy situations. So
yeah. And I do want to just touch back. You mentioned that staff do best when they feel seen, and I think that's such a great point too. And I know that might feel daunting, like you have a staff of however many, you can't know everything going on in all of their lives or what they're doing, like, micro level, but just to like check in with people, right? Like, hey, that table, I saw the way you did that and it was great.
Yeah.
Or last week you told me you were going to do this activity. How was it? Tiny things like that make such a difference in someone's life. And that goes for all interactions with human beings, but especially when it's your boss, just to know that like they respect you as a human and not just like a worker bee, I think is beautiful.
For sure. And like, Jessica, I love that, because as we talk about, guest interactions and the dehumanization that can come from that, we don't want to, if we're a leader in the community or a leader within the organization, a manager, a lead, whomever, we don't want to add to that dehumanization. And that's something that I see happening a lot, that it's not just from the guests, often it is from management or ownership. It's that it's a turn and burn and transient role in industry. So how could you possibly feel appreciated for, and how is that social exchange possibly happening if we're just continuously dehumanizing folks in the service industry and, thinking like everybody's replaceable, and I want to also, it's 3:45 already. I also want to bring up within this context of talking about like the emotional life between manager and team is creating boundaries for yourself. Because as a manager, people come and tell you stuff sometimes, and even when I was a manager and a therapist, I was like, yo, this is the boundaries, it's a lot. Yeah. And it's a lot. And I can imagine there's a need to help people because you can see that it's not always the healthiest situation happening. So you feel this need to help, because that's very inherent in our industry anyway. But the best thing that you can do to help your people is to get them the resources that they need. You taking that big stuff on that some of your team might be telling you isn't necessarily going to help. It might feel good for both of you at the time, but long term, it's not. It's going to start to wear on you. There's emotional labor,
and it's cyclical because once you honor that one time, it's going to keep happening again and again, and there's going to be dynamics formed that will create awkward spaces for that person, you, and then if anyone else is involved. If other people observe that relationship where you're, going out of your way to help one person, other people are going to expect that. All kinds of things like that.
Yeah.
Will come out of that.
Yeah. But
I think that's a great point.
But the more you can, if you think about that, to mitigate burnout and to cut off burnout, perceived organizational support has to be high. Finding ways to support people, even if there isn't money for it, providing education, there's that whole meme about pizza parties, which I always think about perceived organizational support. Like, oh, you're not paid enough, you're not this, get a pizza party, high five. That's an attempt at creating perceived organizational support. But if you can actually go in and find ways to support people, again, by providing education, by checking in with them, by managing like kind of what that overall energy of the space is, that's going to be really, really important when people are giving so much emotional labor and not always able to take that back as well. Okay, it's 3:48. I know we are running over, but I'm going to give it a few more. If anyone has any more questions, I want to check in with everybody and make sure that they're feeling okay too, because again, these are bigger topics, and
absolutely
kind of confusing too. And I also want to make sure that, we've addressed everything. I think we did for people. So if you have questions, holler right now. Training, knowing exactly what we were supposed to be doing. Yo, a big thing in workplace burnout is a unclear job description. That's a huge burnout indicator too.
I talk about this all the time in our industry too, because most people enter this industry because they need money and they need it quickly. And so people take jobs not thinking about those things, not thinking, the most clear-minded. And then they're in these positions that are confusing and disorganized.
Yeah.
I think that's so important.
Yeah. Well, awesome. Very good. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I hope this was helpful for you. Oh, yeah. Thank you for posting the survey. I hope it was helpful for you. Yeah. And the survey on healthypoor.org, if you haven't taken it yet, I ask that you take it. Yeah. So the survey is about, there's a burnout scale in there, also general mental health and substance use and stress. So it's helping me to understand, what is happening in the industry in terms of mental health right now, which will allow us to advocate for maybe more resources for our industry, grant funding, other research, things like that. So yeah, that's like, take it, share it with your friends. It's totally anonymous, but really, really important with what we're dealing with right now. Well, wonderful. Thank you, everybody, so much. Have a wonderful day, whatever that means for you, and be kind to yourself and take care of yourself. And we will see you next week. Okay. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.